In part one of the introduction, I referred to something called composition when we looked at the abstract art. In part two, we're going to look a little bit more at what composition is. Two different types of composition are talked about. There's classical, what I call the Kodak definition, because Kodak was a leader in photo education for over 100 years. And Kodak wrote lots of books and made presentations. And the definition that they settled on was that composition is the pleasing selection and arrangement of the parts of a picture. Artists are usually trying to make something that pleases the public. They want it to be something that the eye can enjoy examining. We were talking a little bit ago in part one about doing the most with the least. So here we're interested in selecting certain things to put in a picture, and we're going to reject, we're going to leave certain things out of a picture. Once we have everything selected, then we look at our format, F-O-R-M-A-T. That is the shape of our artwork, and in the case of a camera, that will be a rectangular viewfinder. It could be a sideways horizontal rectangle, or it could be an up and down vertical rectangle. But what we're going to do then is figure out where in the rectangle we're going to put the objects that we have selected. If we do everything right, then we get a great picture. If we don't quite get it right, then we have a picture that might be a retake. We're going to need to retake it. Perhaps we can take care of problems in post-processing. That means Photoshop or Snapseed after the fact, after we've taken the picture. If there's something in the picture that we don't like, sometimes there's a spot healing tool, there's a clone stamp tool, there's a way to simplify the picture and erase a certain part of the picture that's objectionable. So think about these three parts. Pleasing, you're trying to make a picture that people want to look at, what we call take a second look at. Selecting, think about what you need and what you don't need in a picture. And arranging, how to put things in a place where we build up an eye traffic pattern and one thing leads to the next. Here we have a picture of Edward Weston, and not only did he say art is the outer expression of inner growth, but he redefined composition in a short phrase. And he said, forget about all the rules. Composition is simply the strongest way of seeing. I'm going to ask you in assignments to challenge yourself, and maybe it's going to be how to photograph an ordinary object and turn it into an extraordinary object. And I'll be giving you some advice, and the advice is make sure that you examine, before you even start shooting, make sure you examine the object that you're going to photograph from many different angles and viewpoints, even maybe looking at it under different types of lighting conditions. And as you're examining the object, you say to yourself, better, worse, better, not so good, better, up, and then finally you're going to settle on one angle and one lighting and one everything. And that's the strongest way of portraying that object. And then you press the shutter button and you capture that, and you're taking Edward Weston's definition and you're saying, I have photographed this the strongest way of seeing. So in part one, we talked about a nonverbal language. Well, verbal languages have words and they have grammatical order and structure. When we study the visual arts, elements, those are like the words in language. They're what we call the building blocks. These are things that artists learn about and they manipulate. And the principles of design are similar to the grammatical rules that a writer would use to create quality writing. We won't go into these right now. I just want to point out the fact that if you Google these and if you start being curious about them, you're going to find different lists of elements of art. These are 7 that have come down frequently in many art books, but there will be other teachers who think that there are other elements of art. We're going to be studying these in our guidelines for composition. It'll be on page 3 of your free textbook. And since we had 7 elements, we have 7 principles of design. Again, page 3 on the free textbook, guidelines for composition. You're going to learn to look for these. As you're taking pictures, you're going to be asked to look for these in a finished photograph when you do a critique, a self-examination on how well you did with your camera, whether the photograph could be improved or not. Photographs follow a long history of visual art. Visual art started 30,000 years BC. So we have 32,000 years of artists making art. And all during that time, there have been artists who used their minds in an analytical way, and they were creating artwork and visuals that invited the viewer to think about a topic or think about a subject. And then there were other artists over the centuries and centuries who were using visual art as an emotional push. They were aiming their artwork not at a person's thinking capacity, but they were aiming at their feeling capacity. Now, is it possible to have one piece of art that does both? Sure. But I think what we're going to find out is that certain subjects might be best portrayed in an analytical fashion, and then there's going to be plenty of time when you're going to want to use your artwork, like music, to make people feel different things. Part of what goes into creating a mood, and this goes into making for feelings, in a visual is lighting. First, you're going to be learning how to operate your camera. What are all the buttons for? How to get it in focus? How big of a file do you want to use? How do you store memory? These are all hardware issues, and they're important. Next thing that we need to think about is going to be lighting, and many people just don't even think about this, especially in the age of phone photography, where you just point and shoot. You don't think about the lighting that you're in. But we're going to become much more intentional. We're going to learn that there are 3 directions of light, and we're going to learn that there are 2 qualities of light, and the subject will feel or look differently depending on which direction and what quality we use. Here's an example of front light. Keep the sun at your back. When you keep the sun at your back and you raise the camera up to your eye, all of a sudden you're going to realize that the subject matter is being bathed in direct light. The shadows are going to fall behind the subject, and a lot of the times the shadows are going to become hidden by the form itself. This is one of the faults of front light. It makes your subject look more 2-dimensional than 3-dimensional. Many photographers love side light, and side light is when you're aiming your camera at an object and you check for the sun and you realize that the sun is kind of in line with your shoulders. It's at a 90-degree angle to your subject matter. So these sand dunes here, these little textures in the sand are highlighted. They have a very bright side and then they have a shadow side to them because the sun is off to the right at a 90-degree angle to the subject. Backlight, I have to warn everybody right here, right now, that backlight can be a big problem to a photographer. When you point your camera at a subject and there's a strong light behind the subject, in this case there is a sun which is staring directly into your lens, you can get what's called lens flare, which are big white streaks or hexagons of light that are branded all over your picture, and they get in the way. I would say try and avoid backlight, but at the same time I can't say try and avoid backlight, because backlight can create some wonderful, wonderful moody kinds of pictures. You'll notice that the detail in the people here have become silhouettes. So we know that they're people. We can kind of figure out a gender, we can figure out an age and that sort of thing from postures, but we can't tell a whole lot about them. So now we have late afternoon, I'm going to guess, maybe evening kind of picture where the sun's going low, people are on the beach, there's water in the background. The shadows, if you'll notice the shadows, they're coming towards the camera. And part of what you're going to learn in this class is to read shadows. Don't just look at the subject. Try and look at the shadows and figure out what direction they're pointing, and also how the shadows' edges are. here we have two different qualities of light. The picture on the right, if you look at the shadows underneath the spoons, they're practically not there. There are some shadows, but they're very soft and the edges are diffused. And we call this diffused light, or we call it indirect light, or we call it soft light. Picture on the left, you have fairly well-defined shadows. You could almost pretend that they've been cut out of a piece of black paper and put down underneath the spoons. That's called direct light. Now, as we go along and as you experiment, I want you to try and think which type of subject responds best to which kind of light. About 95% of all beautiful pictures of people are made with diffused or indirect light, and only a few, maybe these are portrait studies of old folks who have lots of wrinkles, workers who have been toughened up at very hard menial jobs. Then the photographer might use a direct kind of a light, and athletes who are, real buff and they have chiseled bodies and musculature that shows up. That would be the time that you might use a direct kind of light to emphasize all of the structure and the texture. But when we shoot portraits, I'm going to be teaching you to try and find shadows that are very soft, and we also call that wrap around lighting.